Research that resonates.
Schweizer has not been wrong on any of his years and years of reporting on the Bidens.
Investigations that matter.
If your last name wasn't Biden, do you think you would have been asked to be on the board of 𝑏𝒂?
I don't know. Probably not. But that's, I don't think that there's a lot of things that would have happened in my life that if my last name wasn't Biden.
The only entities, the only people that would report on this, and Peter Schweizer, who deserves a Medal of Freedom, in my view.
This is The Drill Down with Peter Schweizer.
Hi, this is Peter Schweizer, and welcome to The Drill Down, where we relentlessly expose cronyism, corruption, and the abuse of power in Washington, D.C. The co-host of this program, of course, 𝐃𝐫𝐤𝐥𝐿. Eric, how are you?
Peter, I am excellent. I'm very excited. Not only is it close to the election, and so it's a big moment for the people that care about the stuff we care about, but our guest today has been doing some of the same work that we've been doing at the Government Accountability Institute, and it's fun to kind of talk to a colleague an expert in government corruption who's got an awesome new book out that I think exposes a lot of things that people are going to be very interested to learn about.
Yeah, it's this book, Rights and Freedoms in Peril. It's by Tom Fitton. Judicial Watch was founded in 1994. I'm old enough to remember when it was founded. Tom joined in 1998 and is now the president of the organization. And really, I've seen the exponential growth of this organization from a small and effective unit to the behemoth that it is today. So, Tom, it's great to have you here to talk about the book. We really wanted to focus on two areas, right? We wanted to talk about lawfare, the origins of lawfare, and then we want to talk about election integrity. But let's first go to this issue of lawfare. What do you say to the theory that the reason that they have engaged in so much lawfare against Donald Trump is as a pushback to all the corruption talk that Donald Trump is engaged in about draining the swamp, about the institutional problems, the kind of work that you and we have been doing for years? Do you think there's a link between the lawfare as a weapon and this focus on the swamp by Donald Trump?
Yes. And you're old enough to remember, at least you admit to being old enough to remember the Clinton years, right? And, there was pushback on the investigators. They targeted those who were critics of Clinton. They tried to smear Judge Starr, who was the special counsel or independent counsel at the time. But, it was just typical Democrat, Republican political operations against your enemies. And I think what's metastasized in the last several years is exactly your point, that they're willing to tear down the institutions of our government and abuse the rule of law in ways never seen before in order to protect themselves. It was to protect Hillary. Frankly, it was to protect Obama. And concurrently, and there was this kind of mild fever. We didn't know much at the time, except some of us looking at things closely, like President Trump. It was to protect the Biden racketeering operation. And in order to do so, they'll tear that. They'll, if it means destroying the Supreme Court, they'll destroy the Supreme Court. If it means jailing innocent Americans, they'll jail innocent Americans. If it means suppressing the First Amendment civil rights of countless and millions of Americans, they'll do that. We've never really seen that before in this country, that, they want to tear down the temple in order to protect themselves.
So what was it specifically? I think you're exactly right. But just because you say they were protecting Hillary and protecting Obama, what do you think they were protecting them from? What was it about Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama that were being protected? Because I do think, we were talking about this before the show, it's a wild time to be in the business about talking about government corruption and all the steps, like not just tearing down the institutions. They put somebody on the ballot who received no primary votes to beat this guy after 2 impeachments and 4 lawsuits and criminal charges. I mean, they're doing everything they can think of. So we know what the Biden racketeering operation was, and as well as anybody. What was it about Hillary and Obama you think they were protecting?
Well, someone I know wrote a book, I think, called Clinton Cash. But we both, and you remember back in the day, we partnered up formally or informally, right, to investigate these issues related to Hillary Clinton. and her fundraising operations at the State Department. And of course, subsequent to that, we uncovered the Clinton email scandal, which further documented not only her abuse of the classified information processes, but her willingness to use that State Department quite forthrightly, because it's in the emails, to take care of donors to her Clinton Foundation, which was the political base and structure through which she was going to be running her campaign for the presidency. And of course, none of that was seriously investigated by the Obama administration. Of course, they all knew that, and that was part of the scandal they're covering up, who knew what and when. And of course, Obama himself had some personal corruption issues while in office. He sicked the IRS on an entire political movement, the Tea Party movement, and helped him gain re-election in 2012. There was a lesson there for the deep state and the Obama gang. And then, of course, he abused his power further in 2016 with an unusual intervention in the election behind Hillary, and then weaponizing all of his agencies to not only target Trump, but then to ensure with Joe that they continued to engage in sedition against him once he became president. That's what should have been criminally investigated by the Justice Department. Instead, the Justice Department was frozen, targeted Trump, and they've never stopped. And it's gotten worse in the sense now they see an opportunity, or they saw an opportunity, to try to jail him and freeze his election campaign. And I think the election's been compromised as a result. Trump may win, but the question is, depending the result, will it be seen as legitimate given the intervention by the Justice Department under Biden-Harris in the campaign?
Yeah, and we want to talk to you about voter integrity and your sense of what this election is going to look like here in a couple of weeks. But before we leave the area of lawfare, you talk about lawfare a lot in your book, Rights and Freedoms in Peril, your new book that's just out. But I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on the origins of this, because it seems to me there are two possible inspirations for this lawfare, right? One of them possibly could be, this is a continuation of kind of what the national security apparatus did on the war on terrorism. Remember, there was lawfare employed in the war on terrorism to try to defund and harass terrorists. That's one possible source of inspiration, that they took that strategy that was used against the terrorist enemies of the United States, and now they're applying it to political opponents. But the other possible inspiration is Latin America. I mean, this has been going on in Latin America for a very long time, and you do have a lot of this cross-pollination, particularly with the Clinton-Biden teams, but also with Obama, where they had relations with a lot of the Latin American left, whether that's Lula in Brazil. And these guys have been doing this stuff for decades, right? Trying to throw their political opponents into jail, harass them, and bankrupt them. So do you have any thoughts or speculation on where the inspiration or the idea came from for the deep state, for these political actors to say, you know what, it's time to take the gloves off and actually risk burning down our entire institutions to get rid of our political opponents?
You know me long enough. I don't use the word communism lightly in the context of modern American politics.
Right.
But there's been this communist rising, this movement rising within, frankly, the Democratic Party. It's been embraced in large measure by the leadership there. And does it mean that Democrats are communists? Of course not. But it does mean that the political approach has become totalitarian and communist in approach, as you highlight with their this transnational left movement that inherently is authoritarian and totalitarian. And Americans have largely kind of escaped that. There's always exceptions to kind of highlight where it kind of failed. You saw that with Nixon and the targeting of Trump through impeachment. But there's been this wild embrace of that approach. And you're right about the deep state. People say, well, they weaponized the tools available to target terrorists. Well, the deep state doesn't really care much about terrorists abroad. I mean, they're ideological leftists. They don't necessarily are terrorists, but they certainly support the ideological agenda. So it's not an easy, it's a easy, it's an easy turn for them to say, well, forget about them. We support Hamas. Israel's terrible. I use that by way of example. The real terrible people are here in the United States, and they're our fellow citizens.
And they use the term terrorist on them sometimes, Tom, right? I mean, now you've got people that are concerned about what's going on in their classroom. They reclassify them as terrorists. So lawfare now becomes a tool to use.
Or the domestic violent extremists or domestic extremists. And you see that language throughout, all the federal government. I mean, we were just sued the other day. The Army had a DEI or security training program that listed as terrorists pro-lifers. Just pro-life. I mean, there was nothing like, this group did a bombing. It was if they belong to national right to life and run pro-life pregnancy centers, they're threats.
And that's the Army.
And that's the Army. And they're pretending it was just one document that slipped through. And, I think we've all been litigating and exposing and understanding the military to understand that a document like that doesn't slip through. It's probably been approved by 75 layers of chain of command bureaucracy.
Our understanding is that the Army doesn't necessarily foster a culture of individual initiative, I think, to your point. I think you're correct about that. Now, you mentioned a couple things. One of the things that we love about what you guys do, Tom, at Judicial Watch is you get firsthand source documents. And, so that it becomes unassailable because, no, this is what they've said. This is what their own material has said. And you would think that, like you referenced Nixonian days, and you told us before we started filming that the painting over your shoulder is actually from Nixon's last meal in the White House. And that's an example of when mainstream press cared about government corruption. And I'm just wondering if you've seen a shift over the last decade as we have, because you might still produce really interesting material. But what happened to us after Clinton Cash, because Clinton Cash was used, some would say, to the benefit of the Trump campaign and ultimately helped to lead to the Trump presidency. And then so what we saw was then no mainstream media outlets, were interested very much in the things we had to say anymore. Did you guys experience something similar, or has it all? I mean, when did you see the shift in terms of the? Okay, we're interested in that, but if it has this political ramification, then maybe we're less interested in it.
Well, Nixon partisans would say the media was never, quote, interested in corruption ever. Certainly in the modern media. I mean, that they pick and choose, they went after Nixon because of his politics, not because of anything, any principled opposition to what he was doing, since Nixon himself had been victimized by heroes of the media, the Kennedys, and then the Johnson administration. So the media has been partisan for a long time, and they've had this partisan blinder. I wouldn't say blinder because that suggests it's done unwillingly, but a partisan narrative they want to push against their political opponents, that they're corrupt, and their political opponents tend to be conservative and Republican. And a lot of the good government reforms, allegedly, ethics and other things, they're not used to make the government more honest. They're used as vehicles to harass their opponents. And you can see that because the left just violates all those rules with impunity. But someone writes a check for a cent over whatever the limit is in an ethics rule, you would think they killed someone in the middle of the street. What they try to do, and I've seen they've done that to you all as well, is they controversialize your material, and they controversialize you. It does not mean you still can't have an impact. Certainly, we still have an impact, but they try to categorize and dismiss the work. They try to address it by not expanding and pursuing it, but trying to shoot it down and to minimize it. So that's always the challenge because, and in the case of Judicial Watch, we're not a 98-pound weakling. And so we have this independent ability to get this material out separately. And that's something that I think leads to their desperate efforts to censor the internet.
So let me quote from your book again. We're talking to Tom Fitton about his book Rights and Freedoms in Peril. And this is the section on lawfare. And you describe in 2022, the Hillary Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee quietly agreed to pay more than $100,000 in fines to the Federal Election Commission pertaining to the 2016 election. What was the problem? It turns out that the Clinton campaign used a law firm, Perkins Coie, to handle its negotiations with Fusion GPS. Perkins Coie was paid millions by the Clinton campaign and paid the campaign's bill to Fusion GPS for its hard work coming up with a hoax about Trump colluding with Putin. What you essentially point out there is that they got a slap on the wrist, but then Donald Trump was accused of doing the same thing, and they actually brought up charges against him.
Yeah, charged for doing the same
thing. A crime.
He's facing jail over it.
Yeah, exactly. They're trying to put him in jail because of it. What's interesting to me is an individual who I think bridges the lawfare and also a lot of the electoral interference that we're seeing. And I happen to think he's one of the people that could have a big effect on the election that nobody knows about. You certainly know about it. And that's Mark Elias. Tell us about the role that Mark Elias played in lawfare and the role that he is going to play, or the role that he's already playing right now in trying to undermine the integrity of our electoral process.
Well, Elias he worked for the Clinton campaign at Perkins Coie. He then left Perkins Coie. I don't know why, but now I think he has his own shop more or less. But he's a well-regarded, at least among Democratic Party operatives and campaign folk and candidates, as an aggressive lawyer on election administration issues. So if you need something done, no matter what, you go to Mark Elias and he'll get it done for you. Now, you may think that means increasing access to the ballot. No, it means keeping Robert F. Kennedy on or off the ballot, depending on the political needs.
Right.
It means opposing virtually every effort for election integrity, reform. Folks around him and his operations have opposed virtually all of Judicial Watch's. They oppose in principle, and I think directly, depending on the case, our efforts to clean up the rolls or to make sure that ballots aren't counted until the ballots are counted according to law, as opposed to counting them and receiving them after Election Day, which is just outrageous. So you no matter how you slice it, but of course he was running the Clinton campaign, and the question is what he knew about this dossier. And another aspect of that dossier, coming back to the deep state, it was a joint operation between the Clinton campaign and the FBI.
Yeah,
they both were paying Christopher Steele. They both were paying Christopher Steele at the same time to dig up dirt on Trump.
So speaking of joint operations and election integrity, the joint operation that I'm concerned about is, you've got this marriage of open borders, and we have a new report out at the Government Accountability Institute about election threats, and we talk about how there's 5 figures worth of illegal immigrants being imported to these swing states, right? Oftentimes in greater numbers than the margin of victory for these states from the Electoral College standpoint 4 years ago. And at the same time, you've got this Biden Executive Order 14019 that essentially designates these federal agencies to develop the strategic strategies to expand access. So they're going to engage with all kinds of populations and register them to vote, or at least give them information about what it looks like to vote. And there's lots of studies, and this has been sued by a bunch of states. But the worst part about it is that they don't tell you anything about it. They've tried to subpoena these agency heads to come before Congress, and they get stonewalled. What have you guys been able to uncover about this at all? And how big of a role do you think this plays in 2 weeks?
Yeah, I'm generally aware that there's this stonewall. You're not the only one complaining about it. I think others may have sued more directly for the material. The most recent example of where they stand on this issue is the decision to sue both, I think, Virginia and Alabama for doing what states are required to do on a day-to-day basis, which is to make sure non-citizens aren't on the federal voting rolls. And the Justice Department thinks that federal law means you have to leave them on. I mean, that tells you everything you need to know as to what they hope to happen. I always thought the border invasion was never about getting the Hispanic vote. I always thought it was about getting the illegal alien vote. And it's just a numbers game. I mean, we're supposed to pretend that you have how many voting age or near voting age non-citizens present in the United States, both lawfully and unlawfully? 20 million, 30 million? I don't know. None of them are registered to vote. None of them vote.
Well, because it's illegal,
it's a
so they
game.
wouldn't become registered.
They're voting, and the question is, where are they voting? How's it happening? And are we sufficient? Does the law sufficiently curtail it or curtail the threat of it happening, which is as important when you're running elections? You want the people to think their votes count. Otherwise, they won't come.
So as a lawyer and as somebody who sort of leads these legal efforts,
I'm not a lawyer,
but as somebody who oversees like all these legal actions, what's your take? Because the federal government's position when it comes to the cases with Virginia and Alabama specifically is it's not that, hey, you're wrong. It's you started doing this too late. You can't remove illegal voters from the voter rolls outside of this window. You're inside the window. So we're less concerned about election integrity and we're more concerned about, it's like you didn't follow our rules.
Well, this is a podcast, so we can get into the detail here. We've used this law to remove 4 million names from the rolls in the last 2 years. We know what we're talking about. Our election law team is comprised of former Justice Department attorneys who did this type of work for a living. And what that law requires is, look, you can put a program in place to maintain your election rolls, meaning, you send postcards out, you make an inquiry as to whether people are around. And if they don't respond in a certain amount of time, and it's usually it's 2 election cycles, right? Then you can start removing the names. And the law has been interpreted to mean you can't be gauged in that type of systematic process 90 days out of an election, okay? Well, that's a far different matter than individually becoming aware of an ineligible person on the rolls and being told you can't remove the name. They can't say that same process requires you to leave non-citizens on the rolls, even though you find out about it before an election, even just the day before election day. What about a dead person? You can't remove a dead person from the rolls when you find out about it 60 days out? By that logic, no state can clean their rolls. And the suit against Virginia and Alabama sends a signal to others across the states, election officials. You start removing dead people or people that you find out are non-citizens in an obvious way on a case-by-case basis, we're going to come after you. And it suggests to me they want any non-citizens on the rolls to potentially be able to vote and not get caught.
Yeah. Well, so let me ask you this. I mean, it's in a sense an unfair question, Tom, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Donald Rumsfeld said, you don't know what you don't know. But I want to ask you, what is your sense? How confident are you that 2 weeks from now, we're going to have a clear, fair, honest result? Recognizing the caveat, as I said, something could develop, something could be exposed. But right now where you're sitting, how confident are you in the process and how things are going to look 2 weeks from now?
Okay, so the result is going to be what it is. And I think the bigger question is, are the American citizens going to be confident in the result and the outcome in a way that there's no unpleasantness and just national controversy over it? I think those odds are 1 in 3. No, 2 in 3. Well, look, let me go through the scenarios.
You're making us do math in real time, Tom. It's hard.
I'm an English major, not a not a mathematician. So what's one outcome? Election night comes, Kamala sweeps. There's really no question that there won't be any change to the election results, and there's no question she wins on election day. Second scenario, Trump sweeps. He does well among the swing states. There's no scenario he loses. He's confirmed the winner, or maybe found to be the winner by AP or something. And then there's the third scenario. And this is where I don't know what the odds are based on my scenarios, that we don't know who won. And if we don't know who won, that's the result, in my view, of unlawful non-counting of ballots. They've been prepping the battlefield in that regard again, like they did in 2020. Oh, in Pennsylvania, we may not know for days who won. The Michigan Secretary of State, I'm not going to announce to the next day. There's nothing normal about it. Prior to 2020, it's never happened in American history. The idea that we don't know who wins the presidential election on the day of the election is not right. It's not normal. I would argue it's not lawful. And it's prima facie evidence of a corrupted process. And I tell you, if we don't know who won on election day, my guess is it means Trump's going to lose.
Yeah.
And I don't think because of any honest approach to election or vote counting.
It always seems to come down to those urban areas in the swing states, Philadelphia, Milwaukee, Detroit, and Atlanta. And I hope you are wrong. I hope we don't see scenario number 3, but those chances are real. We've been talking to Tom Fitton about his great new book, Rights and Freedoms in Peril. I would encourage everybody to pick up a copy. Tom has been on the forefront of the battle that we have been fighting also. He's been doing it for a very long time with great success. We appreciate all the work that you're doing on our behalf, Tom. Any final thoughts, Eric?
Yeah, I think everything he said is a little chilling. I think he touches on something that is, to me, one of the haunting memories of 2020. Because remember, like, what they're doing now is the same thing they did 4 years ago. They sort of laid the foundation for, we may not know 4 days after the election who won. And we're told that means it's working correctly. Like, that's the language that they used. And then 3-4 days later, they're like, okay, it's over.
Right.
It's now we have decided it's done. And that means there is to be no questioning and no dissent. And in fact, we're going to weaponize our access to social media in conjunction with the deep state DOJ to shut down anybody. And oh, by the way, if you do raise questions, and then on the heels of January 6th, now you're a dissident, now you're a treasonous terrorist, and you may face, as many people have now seen, prison time. So it's like the preamble now that we're experiencing that makes me very worried.
And the worst outcome is that Trump quite clearly wins, but the left doesn't accept it.
Yeah.
And that's another scenario that's scary as well.
Yeah, we need to add that to number 4. So
we're running out of scenarios, right? The permutations and the combinations. There's a factorial in there. It gets weird.
Political calculus, literally.
Yeah,
exactly. Well, Tom, again, we appreciate you for joining us, and we also appreciate the audience for taking the time to listen. You can find out more about our work at thedrilldown.com, and you can find this podcast wherever fine podcasts are located. Until next time, thanks a lot for listening.